Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever it may be, and welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Beaten Track, Unlocking Tourism Growth Across the Asia Pacific. Uh, Today's webinar is done in conjunction with our good partners at Airbnb. Now, before I begin, let me first introduce myself. My name is Paul Pruangkarn. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Pacific Asia Travel Association, also known as PATA. Now, before we jump into the webinar, I do have a quick housekeeping note. I know that many of you are familiar with Zoom already, but just as a reminder, as you can see at the bottom of your browser, you'll see a chat function and a Q&A function. We will have a time for discussions at the end of after the presentation. Of course, any questions for our panelists, feel free to submit them using the Q&A function as shown on your screen. For the chat function, please don't put any questions using the chat function. However, feel free to say hello to the other participants or any comments you want, but any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function as shown on the screen, located at the bottom of your browser. Now, before we get into our first presentation, please welcome to the webinar, PATA CEO, Mr. Noor Ahmad Hamid, for his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, tourism has the power to transform places, but more importantly, when done thoughtfully, it has a profound impact on people and the communities. Thank you for joining us today for the Beyond the Beaten Track, Unlocking Tourism Growth Across Asia Pacific, part of the PATA webinar series. This is an important conversation indeed, because the way people travel across our region is changing, and that shift is reshaping destinations, communities, and the tourism industry as a whole. And in fact, across Asia Pacific, travel is moving beyond the familiar gateways and major cities. More travelers are looking to regional, rural, and community-based experiences. While this brings exciting new opportunities, it also comes with responsibility. The challenge is no longer just about attracting visitors, but being truly ready for them. So tourism must create meaningful, long-term value for local economies and the people. And this shifts, ladies and gentlemen, the growing importance of good data, practical strategies, and strong collaboration between government, industry, and communities. When this comes together, tourism can deliver lasting benefit, not just for visitors, but for the people who live in these destinations every day. And that is why today's session matters. Over the next hour, we will explore fresh data, real-world examples, and insights from experts working directly with destinations. We'll look at partnerships approaches and preparedness strategies, and at what destination readiness really means beyond marketing, from skills and infrastructure to policy and planning. Today's webinar is made possible through our long-standing partnership with Airbnb, and we are grateful for their continued support. I'm also pleased to warmly welcome our speakers, Mich and Katherine Cossyvas from Airbnb, and Ritchie, the CEO of the Regional Australia Institute. Thank you for sharing your insight with us. As part of this collaboration, PATA and Airbnb have also released the latest edition of Tourism in Focus, available on our website for complimentary download. Before I close, thank you once again to Airbnb, our speakers, and all of you for being with us today. At PATA, we remain committed to supporting our community as tourism continues to evolve. And we hope today's discussion leaves you with practical ideas you can take forward. On that note, I wish you a productive and insightful session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Noor. Unfortunately, Nora wasn't available to join us this morning, so that was pre-recorded. But thank you very much for those welcome remarks. And without further ado, let's jump to our first presentation of the morning. And please welcome to the webinar, the Strategic Initiatives and Policy Manager for APAC at Airbnb, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Katherine Cossyvas. Katherine? Katherine.
Yes, great to be here. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right, the stage is yours.
Wonderful. Great. So hi, everyone. My name's Katherine Cossyvas. I'm from Airbnb's APAC public policy team. Before I jump in, I'd like to extend a huge thanks to PATA for partnering with us on today's session and for creating the space to talk about tourism dispersal across the region. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through some new findings from our Beyond the Beaten Track report, which looks at how travel patterns across Asia Pacific are shifting and what that means for regions, communities, and policymakers thinking about the future of tourism. We're at an interesting moment. On the one hand, travel can feel more concentrated than ever, the same destinations, the same images, the same hotspots. But at the same time, the data tells a different story. Across APAC, more travelers are actively choosing to go beyond major cities and well-known tourism centres. They're seeking out smaller towns, rural areas, and places that offer a stronger sense of connection to people and to place. And with this report, we've brought together platform data, independent traveller polling across 8 APAC countries, and real-world case studies that show how regional tourism is reshaping travel across the region. Drawing on insights from more than 7,000 travellers and highlighting 20 emerging destinations and 14 first-time tourism towns, the report explores 3 questions. What's driving this shift towards non-urban travel? Where is demand already emerging across the region? And what needs to be in place for destinations and communities to benefit from this growth in a sustainable way? And I'll step through those insights now, and we'll unpack what they mean in practice during the panel discussion shortly. So starting with the first question, what's actually driving this shift towards non-urban travel? Well, across Asia Pacific, 89% of travellers say they visited a non-urban destination for leisure in the past 12 months, and 91% say they plan to do so again in the year ahead. Now, that tells us that this isn't niche and it's not experimental, it's already mainstream. And what's also notable is who is driving this. Nearly half of these travellers are Gen Z or millennials, which matters because it suggests that this pattern isn't likely to reverse anytime soon. In fact, these are cohorts whose preferences tend to shape travel markets over the long term. The data also suggests that this goes beyond novelty. For many travellers, going beyond major cities reflects a conscious choice. It comes from a desire to travel differently, to slow down, and to experience places in a way that feels more personal and less crowded. And taken together, this points to a structural shift in demand. So regional and rural destinations are moving from consideration to intention in travellers' planning. That creates a real opportunity for destinations outside traditional hotspots if they're ready to respond. Now, when we look more closely at why travellers are choosing non-urban destinations, a clear pattern starts to emerge. At a basic level, the appeal is intuitive. I mean, nature and scenery, peace and relaxation are the most commonly cited motivations. And each of those were mentioned by just over half of our travellers. And these are the kinds of things and the kinds of experiences that are often harder to find in dense, highly visited urban environments. But the data also points to something more deliberate, and that is a significant majority of respondents, over 80%, say they actively avoid crowded or heavily visited destinations, and 83% place a high value on authentic community-based experiences. And again, that combination matters because it suggests that the shift isn't accidental or purely driven by factors like price. It reflects a conscious decision to travel differently. And for destinations, that's an important signal, of course. These preferences naturally favour places with a strong sense of local identity. Think smaller towns, rural areas, and communities where visitors can engage more directly with people and with places. In other words, tourism dispersal isn't just being driven by pressure in major cities. It's increasingly being pulled by demand for experiences that feel grounded, they feel personal, and they feel connected to local life. And of course, this helps to explain why we're now seeing demand emerge in some very specific places across the region. So given that the demand is real, the next question is naturally where it's already showing up across the region. What we see in the data is steady low double-digit growth in night stayed in non-urban listings across Asia Pacific. That was between Q3 2024 and Q3 2025. Now that's important because it tells us that this isn't a sudden spike or a single market story either. It's actually a pattern that's playing out across very different tourism systems. And one thing worth pausing on here is how domestic this demand is. Around 2/3 of check-ins at non-urban listings across APAC are from domestic travelers. And with that share even higher in markets like South Korea and India. And for policymakers, that has real implications for resilience, for seasonality, and for how regions think about demand beyond international peaks. The report also highlights a number of specific places outside major cities where traveller interest and night stayed are growing strongly. And these include Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, and India. Most of these small places aren't traditionally high-profile destinations. Some are, but they're benefiting from a mix of changing traveller preferences and improved discoverability and local decisions to actually support visitation. And that last point is really key. This growth in non-urban travel isn't random. In many cases, it reflects deliberate choices, whether that's ensuring accommodation exists where hotels are limited or unavailable, making the most of local events, or improving access and visibility. Which brings us to the next part of the report, which is what actually enables this growth to stick and what needs to be in place for destinations to benefit from it in a sustainable way. So like I said, what actually enables that demand to turn into real visitation? Well, one of the clearest enablers is simply whether people can stay there. And according to the research, more than 7 in 10 travellers say they're more likely to visit a rural destination if accommodation options like short-term rentals are available. And 1 in 4 say they wouldn't have actually visited a rural destination at all if these options didn't exist. And that's a meaningful finding because it tells us accommodation isn't just responding to demand. In many cases, it's actually helping to drive it. And this is particularly relevant in smaller towns and rural areas where traditional infrastructure is limited or absent altogether. In those contexts, we've found that short-term rentals often provide the first and sometimes only way for visitors to stay locally. And it's also worth noting who this matters most to. The preference for these kinds of stays is especially strong among Gen Z travellers, which again points to this being a long-term structural shift rather than a short-term adjustment. So when we think about dispersal in practice, accommodation is a critical piece of the puzzle, and it's crucial to creating economic opportunity for small communities. What does that look like on the ground, and how does dispersal translate into real economic outcomes for communities? Well, for hosts, this income is often practical and immediate. Across APAC, more than 1/3 of hosts say they host to help make ends meet as the cost of living rises. And over half actually say that the income they earn helps cover essentials like food and other daily needs. But the impact doesn't stop with hosts, of course. Almost half of hosts hire local tradespeople, think gardeners, plumbers, carpenters, and around 2 in 5 use local professional cleaners after each stay. So over time, that activity supports a local supply chain around tourism, particularly in smaller towns where employment can be limited or seasonal. Guests themselves are also contributing directly to local economies. Among travellers who've taken rural trips, the average reported spend is around $157 USD per person per trip. That's largely spent on food and drinks, groceries, and local markets. And that spending tends to stay local, flowing through small businesses and community services. And what's particularly powerful here is the role hosts play as local connectors. Most guests say they received local recommendations from their host, and almost all say that those recommendations influence where they spend their money, helping direct visitor spending toward independent businesses and local producers. So, taken all together, the report shows that dispersal supports a wider spread of economic participation, especially in places where tourism is still emerging. And with that context, we'll now look at how this is starting to play out in destinations experiencing tourism activity for the first time. So, one pattern that really stands out is the emergence of what we've called first-time tourism towns. And in 2025, a number of communities across Asia Pacific received their very first booking on Airbnb, including towns in Japan, India, Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. For these places, tourism isn't being expanded or redistributed, it's being introduced for the first time. And that creates a very different set of choices around readiness, local benefit, and the kind of tourism communities want to see. And in many cases, traditional hotel accommodation hasn't existed before, and home sharing becomes the entry point. It allows visitors to stay locally and enables residents to participate directly in the visitor economy from the outset. These early signals show how dispersal travel can reach well beyond established tourism corridors and how quickly that can happen when demand, accommodation, and discoverability align. It also highlights why early planning matters. And when tourism arrives for the first time, communities have a rare opportunity to shape how it develops in ways that reflect local priorities and protect what makes those places distinctive. So looking ahead, a few things are clear. Dispersal around Asia Pacific isn't a future scenario, it's already underway. Traveler demand is shifting, it's emerging in new places, and it's increasingly shaped by a desire for connection, authenticity, and balance. And what determines whether that shift delivers long-term value isn't demand alone, it's whether destinations are prepared, and prepared in terms of infrastructure, local capability, data, and policy settings that reflect the local context. And from our perspective at Airbnb, we see a real opportunity to work alongside governments, destination organizations, and communities to share data, support local capability, and really help ensure that tourism growth is managed in a way that benefits residents as well as visitors. And of course, none of this happens in isolation. Dispersal works best when it's shaped deliberately through collaboration across planning, tourism, and community leadership. So for anyone interested in exploring the findings in more detail, the full Beyond the Beaten Track report is now available to read online at airbnb.com/beyond the beaten track. And with that, I will hand back over to Paul, where I believe we'll dig into what this looks like on the ground.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Catherine. Really very insightful and great to hear about the findings from Airbnb. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now let's jump into our panel discussion. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to today's webinar the Director of Public Policy for APAC at Airbnb, Ms. Mich, and the CEO for the Regional Australia Institute, Ms. Liz Ritchie. Liz, Mich, welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Paul. No problem. Before, we know about Airbnb, and Katherine always gave us a little background on that. But before we start, I just want Liz to introduce yourself and your organization, just so people have an idea of what you do and what your organization does over there in Australia.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the opportunity to join today's forum. I have the privilege of being the CEO of Australia's only think tank that's dedicated to rural and regional issues in Australia. We undertake research so that knowledge can be translated into better policy initiatives and overall better investment into rural and regional economies. We've also had more recent years a membership model, so we've been proud to partner and work with our friends at Airbnb as well.
Well, thank you very much, Liz. Just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Liz or Mich, feel free to drop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your browser. So our first question for both of you is, from your perspective, what has changed that makes travel beyond traditional hotspots more viable today? I mean, we know that about the perspectives of the behaviors of a lot of the travelers, especially Gen Z, but what makes that more viable today in today's age, especially post-COVID?
Do you want me to start, or Mich? Paul?
Liz, you can jump in first.
I'll kick off. Sure. Well, can I just say I love that report, Katherine. There was so many interesting insights in there. And I think to the heart of your question, what was coming through in that data is actually really consistent with what we're seeing happening across Australia at large in terms of sentiment to move to regional Australia. So one of the things that I think is really important in the discussion around tourism is that tourism's a precursor for people thinking more broadly about where they might like to live. And so those opportunities and that analysis that was telling us that they're in search of nature and being near the environment, having those scenic experiences where they can deeply relax and feel at peace, feel more connected to places and to people, very much mirrors what people are actually chasing in their lives as well. So I think there's some really, really good synergies that we're seeing there. And so when we think about more broadly, then where are people domestically choosing to holiday? Well, if you take the understanding that people are choosing to live outside of capital cities more and more, then they're being exposed to broader choices and options across, in my case, across Australia. And so parts of the country that they may not have actually had exposure to may now not be too far from their new homes and could be a short couple of hours drive away. I know a couple of the places that came up there as hotspots, Strathbogie and the Hepburn, but they're not, they're a little bit off the beaten track as well. So understanding that popularity is born out of many factors, and I think places develop this sort of uniqueness, and in a way, their unique selling proposition. But much of it is about the experience that they're going to get in that place. I can talk about my own backyard now. I live in a beautiful regional location that's a popular tourist destination it's called the Sapphire Coast, southern part of New South Wales, for those on the webinar who know their geography. And some of the experiences that people are having while they're here is actually getting to understand the oyster farm industry as an example, because we're well known for our oysters in this part of the world. And so people are traveling far and wide to go and have this, rare and beautiful experience. That's very localized, very unique in a very beautiful and scenic location. And we've seen for many years the agricultural sector, leveraging its seasonality, if you will, leveraging their location and their best assets to share what is, a everyday life for them is a unique experience for city dwellers and people who perhaps, didn't grow up in the land. So look, I think some of those findings around that connection for uniqueness, connection to place, connection to that environment really speak to why I think people are making choices further afield than they once did.
Yeah, I think to add to what Liz I was also saying, I think we saw that very clearly from the report that we commissioned, right? I think tourism disposal is already happening. So we saw that 9 in 10 travelers have visited a non-urban destination in the past year. And I think a lot of what Liz mentioned about the social, I guess, value of travel, like that's definitely coming true. So travel is no longer just a leisure activity. It's no longer just like recognized as a thing that you go on to see sites or to see landmarks, but it's really, I think, increasingly seen as a way to connect people, to support communities, and to also just strengthen regional economies. Another point that I think Katherine made earlier also, which we've seen as being really important, is that in many of the regional destinations, hotel infrastructure is not very developed, the traditional tourism infrastructure is not very developed. So short-term rental and alternative accommodations has really helped unlock unlock these destinations where infrastructure has been a little bit more limited. I think at the same time also, so a lot of my role involves speaking with governments in the APAC region. And you can see that there is a clear desire by almost all of the governments in this region to continue to grow tourism. And most of them have extremely ambitious growth targets. So Japan wants to welcome 60 million tourists by 2030. And Thailand, for example, wants to welcome 40 million guests by 2026, which is the end of this year. I think they all also recognize that if they want to hit these ambitious targets, it can't just be people traveling to Kyoto, Osaka, Tokyo, or to Bangkok, Phuket, Pattaya. They really need to be thinking about how to spread travel throughout these very large countries, and to make sure also that they are balancing, I guess, both the economic opportunity of tourism with community well-being and with sustainability at the same time. So governments are increasingly seeing tourism dispersal as a much needed and like practical strategy to achieve both the growth targets that they want as well as balance at the same time. I think the report that we published also hopefully gives people a lot of travel inspiration to different parts of this region. A lot of smaller towns have been highlighted as destinations that people are increasingly interested in. Yeah, so places like Hepburn in Australia, like that Liz already mentioned, Lombok in Indonesia, or one that I'm going to go to in May, Itoshima, in close to Fukuoka. All of these are increasingly places that people want to travel to. And I think we've seen that through the data that Katherine shared.
Well, thanks. In Catherine's report, we showed that Gen Z behavior has sort of shifted to looking for those secondary, tertiary experiences. But do you think this is something that is gonna continue on? Is it like here to stay? That shift towards looking for off the beaten track destinations, secondary destinations, will that carry on in the foreseeable future beyond Gen Z, for example?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, but my guess would be absolutely. Again, I think there's a real parallel in the sentiment of city people who live in cities and domestically and what they're looking for in their life and the way the world has shifted. And we know we're actually about to release new data tomorrow, a new report. Early next week, which tells us that Gen Zs and millennials are the fast movers to regions, that they want to live in regional Australia more than our older demographics. And so again, looking at this sort of parallel content here, it's really, as far as I can see, that the unique experience, the more affordable options for younger generations. They're looking for that beautiful Instagrammable moment. And so, they have to go further afield to get that. So without having a crystal ball, I would absolutely say yes, but I could leave that to the experts. Mich?
I think we're not experts on this, but I think what we've definitely seen that transcends, I think, even just the Gen Z generation is a structural shift towards much slower, more local and meaningful travel experiences. So you saw that stat just now, 83% of travelers say that authentic, local, and connected experiences are important to them. And so I think this is something that is just a broader shift in the travel industry. And it's also just a broader shift in the way that people think about travel. So it's not just about where they go, but also how their travel benefits communities and environments as well. And I think another interesting thing that we're seeing on the Airbnb end is that like it's really reflecting, I think, in our host behavior. One of the hosts that's featured in the report that Katherine was presenting about just now, and her photo was actually also in the presentation, is the host that we have, Hayati, who's based in the Perhentian Islands in Malaysia. If you've not been there, it's a beautiful island on the east coast of the state of Terengganu in Malaysia. And there, I think that we've seen a community-led style of tourism start to sprout that's focused like not just on preserving local livelihoods, but also on conservation of the island. So Hayati, her hosting behavior is really interesting. Like she converted an old building into her house that she puts on Airbnb. And she also uses some of the proceeds that she gets from her hosting activity to support turtle conservation on the island, because the island is an important point for turtles to come and lay their eggs. And so she's also very connected, I guess, to the nature points around the island. And so I think what we're seeing here is not really that people are not traveling to cities. I think they're complementing their city-focused travel with a form of tourism that's a little bit more centered in the environment.
So that's just complementing their original travels, right? They'll go to the primary destinations and then venture out for that secondary, tertiary destination to have something more authentic. All right, interesting to note. So I think you mentioned a bit about sort of destination preparedness. How the Airbnb hosts are traditionally in areas where they don't have any hotels. But what does that destination preparedness? What does that actually really look like beyond the Airbnbs and promotion and branding? What does that actually look like in terms of having that secondary, tertiary destination sort of
Yeah.
ready?
Yeah, I guess, readiness to me, I think falls in three broad categories. One is infrastructure readiness, the second is sort of like community readiness, and the third is just the connective tissue amongst key stakeholders from a coordinational point of view. So maybe I'll talk about each in turn. Um, so I think housing and accommodation forms like just a small part of infrastructure readiness. There's a lot that has to happen for a destination to be able to welcome travelers. So transport, for example, there needs to be reliable and efficient transportation networks between cities and regional destinations. Increasingly also because a lot of travel is planned online and through the use of AI, I think digital connectivity such as mobile coverage, high-speed internet, for both visitors as well as for local operators becomes also really essential. And then you also have that entire category of visitor infrastructure such as amenities, signage, parking, rest areas, tourism facilities that can help to make sure that a destination in the regional areas feels ready to welcome guests. And then I guess accommodation is the last piece of this, right? Like in order to travel somewhere, you need to also have somewhere to stay. And so we've seen, like I mentioned earlier, that many emerging regional destinations don't really have the traditional accommodation infrastructure yet. And that's where short-term rentals can really bridge this gap in capacity and can also allow more destinations to welcome visitors while also ensuring at the same time that the community benefits from the economic impact of the travel. The second pillar I talked about was like community readiness, and I think that's another thing that's extremely important. And there I think a lot about training programs. So how can we make sure that tourism operators, that hospitality providers, that customer service representatives understand the opportunities around tourism and also understand how to best welcome new travelers into their area. That's something that we've been very invested in as Airbnb. So we have launched since 2017 academies across the world that are essentially focused on building capacity of local communities outside of typical tourist areas to be able to host more guests. And then I think the final thing that I mentioned was really about connectivity amongst key stakeholders. I think all of this cannot be done in isolation. So all players involved in the industry need to be talking to each other, whether you are a tourism board or a local government or a think tank involved in a regional development, or even platforms like ours. I think everybody needs to be working together to make sure that they're sharing information, sharing insights so that destinations can better understand how to best balance tourism growth in their area.
Well, Liz, let me ask this. I mean, Mitch sort of gave us the three pillars, but then what do you see as like the most common gaps or the biggest gaps between, well, these three pillars or other aspects, whether it's like coordination, workforce readiness, what those gaps or that we need to sort of fill in that you see from your ends?
Mm. Yeah, look, I mean, Mich did a beautiful job in outlining, I guess, where you would see some of those common gaps. And particularly when we're talking regional Australia, infrastructure and transport are kind of two of the biggest issues, whether that's road, public transport options, and or aviation options. So I'm lucky enough to be in a regional location that does have an airport and aviation access. And whenever they've expanded that route, you see an increase in tourism to this part of the world. Likewise, where places have lost their aviation connection, it speaks to reason that there's a reduction in visitation. So transport and ensuring that transport connectivity in all its forms is readily available and being well thought through in terms of timing and access. Roads themselves, these are a perennial challenge for a country like ours that regularly has disasters and floodings, and there's all sorts of issues that happen with transport and road upgrading, the expense of keeping that to a very high standard. I think all of our governments do the best they can, but it's hard to keep on top of keeping roads in good condition. So that they are really strong factors. And then the second, I think you touched on the workforce. This is really tricky because whilst you really, like anywhere that's seasonal, we've just been through our peak season here. Summer creates all sorts of opportunities, and then what happens after that season? And so more and more regions are looking to where they can partner with other regions and start to share the types of skills that we know are needed across tourism, in hospitality, and baristas and cleaners and so on, receptionist support, administrative support. So I know locally there's some partnerships here between, I'm in a coastal area, but with our mountain areas, which are not too far from here as well, and starting to look at some really good initiatives where those barriers can start to seek to be solved in ways that mean that there's less turnover and more consistency. Once you've skilled and invested in your people, you don't want to have to keep replenishing that year on year, because it's really draining. It's time consuming and costly to regional businesses who are already time poor. So where you can actually start to get I don't know, merit economies where they can share those resources and think strategically about wider regions rather than just your own smaller region, and really capitalize on that skill development. I think some big opportunities there. And thirdly, accommodation in and of itself. I think it absolutely is fact that the short-term accommodation market has opened up an extraordinary amount of new visitation. The unique experience that it provides in many places, but also Australia, and I'm sure similar to other parts around the region, is we've got a lot of old stock in our old motels and hotels that really aren't fit for purpose. And so without major investment and overhaul, there isn't the kind of diversity and range of accommodation in our traditional markets. So the short-term accommodation market is really filling an important gap, and in fact and we can see is part of the driver for new visitation. So I think there's other facets as well.
I just want to follow up on sort of this line of discussion here. Mitch, you talked about connectivity amongst stakeholders, right? In terms of, whether it's especially when we talk about community readiness or infrastructure. But our stakeholder, I mean, a lot of times we are just talking to ourselves. So some of the stakeholders involved actually go beyond tourism, right? On the Ministry of Tourism. How do you sort of bring into those other departments into that conversation? Whether it's Ministry of Transport or Waste Management or other departments that are essential when you're talking about preparedness or preparedness for that particular destination.
Yeah, I think Paul, you asked this a really interesting question about gaps, right? I think
Yeah.
different destinations have different gaps, and so to me, I think taking kind of a destination focused view is really important. and really understanding what the gaps are in specific like emerging destination or secondary destination is going to be the starting point. So if the gap is more infrastructure related, then we need to bring the right people into that discussion because those are long-term decisions that need to be pre-planned and made and usually involve like quite a high level of investment. So I think really identifying what the gap or the challenge that the area is facing is the starting point. And if it is really more about the community preparedness, like that is another thing that can be focused on. But I think really understanding where the gaps are key. I think the other layer to this also is that governments tend to play a really central role in creating the policy settings and the policy environments that allow for tourism to grow in specific ways. And so, in order to ensure that, I guess, regional or rural tourism continues to grow in step with both the infrastructure and the community, like the government needs to be setting out pretty clear framework, and also investing in infrastructure as well as workforce development programs that can then support greater participation in the tourism and visitor economy. So I think having the problem statement, and then also speaking directly with governments to help them understand the opportunities around rural tourism is key.
And so really having the government being involved in that and taking the lead in terms of, getting all the different stakeholders together. So in terms of that, then, where do you see, for both of you, so where do you see the greatest opportunity for better partnerships between governments, platforms, DMOs, and communities?
Mm. Do you want to start that, Mich, or shall I?
You can go ahead, Liz.
No, go ahead, Liz.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a perennial challenge in every issue. As a leader of a think tank, we talk about, I guess, whole of economy, and we think about regional Australia as a regional ecosystem. So when we're talking about tourism, we're also talking about jobs and skills and infrastructure and housing, all of the facets that go to make up, I guess, the local economies that we live in. And so, better partnerships, better collaboration, better decision making, and indeed decision making from those who actually live in place. So one of the challenges in regional development has been that decisions are often made and can often be made in government without due understanding of how those policy decisions and or investments will actually land on the ground in regions. And so we see, what we would like to see is that we want to see more regional voices at the decision-making table, where governments and private sector are making decisions about their investment into regions. So this is not just a tourism conversation to us. This is a story about ensuring greater prosperity, economic and social prosperity across our regions. And so, this notion of collaboration becomes critical in all its forms. We definitely need government to have the ambition, and I love Mich talked about some of the numbers that our international friends have on the table around their tourism ambition. I mean, you have to have ambition to grow. And so what will it take to back up that ambition, and who are the right people that need to be at the table to make those decisions? It's frameworks are really important, sitting alongside that ambition, and then ensuring that at a local level there's really good community understanding about the opportunities, but also that they understand their own gap and their own barriers to growth. Because I think, at a local level, they're not short on aspiration either. It's often just some of the barriers that they themselves can't solve. Where they can, they generally do.
Yeah,
Want to
and
add?
sorry. I like how Liz talked about collaboration because I really think it is the word that underpins like all of the opportunity that we're seeing in this space. We have done quite a lot in partnership with governments and with local organizations throughout this region. And I think we've seen it work the best when everyone plays the role that they are strongest in when it comes to collaboration. So for governments, it can really be around like just creating that policy environment, plus also identifying, I guess, areas in which they see as opportunity areas to grow tourism capacity more. For local organizations, I think they know the local communities the best as well. So they become important partners in the ecosystem. And then on the platform end, I think for us, it's really about expanding access to accommodation, sharing data, and also supporting capacity building. To give you a real example of how this has worked well for us, in Goa, we have a long-standing partnership with the government of Goa and with local nonprofit organizations there. And I think Goa really is the place in this region where we have the most established academy that has focused on partnering with women-led self-help groups, with local tourism organizations to essentially train local communities in the hinterland parts of the state, so a bit further away from where travelers typically go to on the beach corridor in the state, to learn how to essentially digitally market their areas, to build tourism entrepreneurship opportunities. And if they want to also to run homestays as a way of getting immediately involved in the tourism economy. So there, it was really only through each partner playing their role and leveraging their strengths that we were able to stand up and like run such a long-standing academy. But I think the other point that I also wanted to make, where I see as an opportunity, is really around resilience and how everyone can come together to foster greater resilience. So we also have a partnership that extends beyond tourism. We have a nonprofit that was founded by Airbnb but operates independently, that's called Airbnb.org. And that organization's goal is really in providing emergency housing in times of crisis. And we partner with several different governments around this region. But I wanted to call out the partnership that we have in Japan, where we essentially worked with the government to establish a nationwide disaster preparedness framework that can activate fairly easily emergency accommodation across all 47 prefectures. And so this is the way that the Japanese government can sort of twin their motivations of ensuring disaster preparedness as well as rural tourism together. And it also really shows how we can build distributed accommodation networks that don't just support tourism growth, but also community resilience at the same time. So I think for us, collaboration is a key point, and I'm glad that Liz raised it as well.
I know during the earthquake here in Thailand, Airbnb was also offering temporary housing for those who might have been affected by the earthquake. So, it's great to hear some of the work that Airbnb does, in that space as well. We do have a question here, so I'd like to get to that one and give the opportunity for you to answer this question. So the question is from Raquel. Her question is, we've been talking about readiness and preparedness, but is it possible for destinations to have their downtimes as well? Like for cleanup, retraining, refocusing, recharging. Mitch, you seem ready to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's an interesting point as well. I think there is. I think when you think about regional or rural destinations, there will be ebbs and flows in terms of the demand. This is something Liz talked about earlier. Also, I think a lot of emerging destinations tend to be more seasonally driven. But I think there needs to be a balance between making sure that there is sufficient demand that is driven to those areas, while also preserving some space for the communities to focus on downtimes as well. But I think the underlying point is just more that if an area is prepared and it's ready already, technically to me, like these downtimes don't need to be that important. Like the capacity of the area should be ready to respond to the demand. And that's where I think short-term accommodation can also play a role, because it is the short-term rentals are in its very nature already very flexible types of accommodation. They're used for multiple purposes and can be used in different times of demand and supply. So yeah, so interesting question. I also like the way that you framed it.
So Liz, you wanted to add anything to that, or?
No, I mean, I love that question too. I'm sort of thinking about it. I think if you're a regional destination and you're geared in that way, there is a question of how much downtime you need or want, because that's part of your living and your means. So, I know I mean, as I've said, I live in what is quite a tourist-oriented area. While sometimes the locals at times are like, oh, we're going to have to queue for this and that, there's always, I think, a celebration of the fact that the region is a place of pride and a place of interest and an attractor. So downtimes, yeah, interesting. I mean, there's always a case sort of economically to smooth out, so there's less peaks and troughs, but I think weather and time of year often guide that as well. So I think, as Mish said, that inadvertently there would be downtime. But I think there's also a question of how much downtime you want if tourism is your business. Mm.
Definitely, especially if it's a big driver for the revenue for the local economies. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, we are coming to the hour, so please, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A. But I'll get to this last question here that I have here. For destinations who are starting their sort of just personal journey, what is the one priority it should focus on in the next 12 months? Mitch?
Mm.
Liz? Mitch?
Um, well, it's a great question. I think, look, it comes back to, from my perspective, I would think of it from a community lens. So if they're kind of getting ready to really embark on a new campaign and preparedness, um, what is that local sentiment and where's the kind of, the rallying call, the interconnectedness between all the businesses that are going to need to function collectively and collaboratively to make it a great success. The coordination piece is so important when it comes to launching anything from a regional perspective. But yeah, when you enter a region and they just get tourism, they have all the pieces of the puzzle together beautifully, and they're working in a kind of seamless way, and that creates a visitor experience. And so, yeah, I would say that a lot of time on the ground, coming together, working out how the various parts of the regional system, in my case, the regional place, would play its part.
Mitch,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I think maybe I'll just go quickly back to something that I mentioned earlier about just understanding where the gaps are in terms of readiness, and then moving ahead to prioritize like accordingly. Because I think every destination is really at a different part of the process and journey. And if the destination can think thoughtfully about where its most prevalent gaps are and start focusing there, that probably makes the most sense to me. I also like what Liz said about the notion, or I guess the analogy of a puzzle, because in practical terms, right, like welcoming more tourists is something that needs to be taken as a whole of destination approach. So whether it is making sure that you're ready from an infrastructure point of view, or from a workforce or skills point of view, or an access to accommodation point of view, or even just from a community sentiment or like a community alignment point of view, um, every piece needs to fit together. And I think the destination needs to be thinking very holistically about all of these areas um, in order to get started and to prioritize, I guess, travel that is successful because the community itself is ready or the infrastructure is aligned and can best welcome travelers.
Well, I think we're getting towards the end of the webinar here. So just give you guys give your final thoughts on this subject, and just talking about sort of what do you see in the next 12 months in terms of, tourism dispersal, how players are looking at it, whether it's governments, whether it's the private sector. Any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with as we close out today's webinar? Mich? Yep.
Yeah, I think for me, when I think about this, it's really that the APAC region is so big, and like amongst all of the countries that are so invested and thinking so ambitiously about tourism, there are so many destinations within those countries itself. So for me, it's really encouraging people to think beyond just the big cities and thinking beyond just the major tourist destinations. So if you're traveling to Japan, try and find a smaller town to visit. If you're going to the Philippines, maybe like head to an island that you've not necessarily heard of before, because I think that is really where you will find more authentic, connected travel, and that is truly, to me, where the direction in which travel is going. Yeah.
Liz, final thoughts.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Mich. Look, I would absolutely second Mich's comments. I mean, it's well documented in Australia that about 50% of all visitation makes its way to regional Australia. I would love to see those numbers increased because of what that, opportunity, economic and social opportunities that brings to regional Australia at large. And of course, I am biased, but regional Australia, whilst our beautiful Sydney Harbour is absolutely gorgeous and well worth a visit, there are so many parts of our country that are, it's a vast nation, but that are off the beaten track. And I think of places like, even up in the Kimberleys and Western Australia, all of those gorgeous vast locations, and then come closer to our capital cities, places that are commuter distance, and the visitation can make such a big difference to those communities. And what we've seen in terms of what I would describe as high street gentrification, where we're getting boutique offerings coming through in a retail sense. So much of that is driven by tourism and visitation. And so many places have created, a name for themselves based on what they've been able to deliver to their tourism economy, and how word of mouth then takes hold, as it does in any nation. So there's probably not one thought, but many thoughts. And as always, I would be a champion for regional Australia.
Hey, 50% is still a fairly large number, and increasing that is ambitious, but 50% is sounds great already. So thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Liz, and thank you so much, Mich, for your time this morning here, and thank you, of course, to Katherine for presenting earlier in today's webinar. So as we come to the close of the hour, I'll just say thank you to Airbnb for organizing today's webinar and our partnership in terms of organizing the reports. And thank, of course, Liz, Mich, and Katherine for their time this morning. So thank you guys, and enjoy the rest of your days. And I'll do a quick wrap up before we close today's webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thanks. All right. Well, so as we just close out the webinar, and as they mentioned today, earlier today, today's webinar is in line with our release of our Tourism in Focus report for this month, and it's with Airbnb, Beyond the Beaten Track, Unlocking Tourism Growth Across Asia Pacific. Katherine did give a QR code where you can download it from their website, but you also can download it from our website as well at the Potter catalog. Just scan the QR code as you see here on the screen, or just go to our website at www.potter.org. Now, if you enjoyed today's webinar, we do have an upcoming webinar in just a few weeks. It's our Asia Pacific Tourism Outlook for 2026-2028, Growth Under Global Uncertainty. The webinar is organized in relation to the release of our Asia Pacific Tourism Forecast reports. We will be joined by Professor Hyan Song from Hong Kong Paul Yu, Mr. Stephen Dutton from Euromonitor International, and Mac Patel from OAG. So please do register today. The webinar is on February 26th at 4 p.m. Singapore time. And then just a quick note about some of our upcoming events. Of course, we have our PATA annual summit later this year in May 11th to 13th in two cities. The first time it's being held in two cities, in Gyeongju and Pohang. So please do register today if you're interested in coming, or for more information, feel free to visit our website. And later on in the year, we have our PATA Travel Marts that'll be taking place in Kuching, Sarawak, Malaysia from August 18th to 20th. Registration is open for both buyers and sellers. We will be working on the conference program soon, so please do keep an eye out for more information. So if any questions about today's webinar or about PATA in general, sorry, this is my colleague's contact. This was not updated, but you can email me. My email is fairly easy. It's paul@pata.org, or again, visit our website at www.pata.org. Once again, thank you to Katherine, Mich, and Liz, and everybody at the Airbnb team for their valuable support. And once again, always thank you to our executive board, our board members, our life members, our partners, our members, and our chapter members for the continued support of the association, without which none of this is possible. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for joining us at today's webinar. I will see you soon. Thank you, take care, and have a good day.